As more and more people begin to come to the Americas for a variety of reasons, some for wealth, some for power, some for the opportunity to seek adventure, some for the opportunity to share their faith, others for freedom and new opportunities. People come to the Americas for a variety of reasons, but those earliest years are very disruptive to the indigenous peoples in both North and South America. As these explorers are traveling, as they are coming into contact with new ideas and new peoples and new faiths, in some cases, those experiences are peaceful and amicable, and in others, they are violent. At the same time, there are changes taking place within individual nations throughout Europe. Now, the Catholic Church was widely criticized because of papal interference in secular matters and because of immorality and ignorance among the clergy. Martin Luther believed that salvation came from faith alone and could be obtained only through God, not by buying indulgences that were sold by the church. Now, these indulgences were sort of get out of hell free cards, if you will, because they were forgiveness for sins that a person may have committed. Now, the frustration here is that because so many people were unable to purchase those indulgences, they were left excluded from being able to fully participate within the church and within their faith. Now, in 1517, Luther wrote a lengthy argument against the practice of indulgences, and this argument was widely disseminated. In the argument, Luther states that faith leads to salvation, and he launched a critique of the Catholic Church, whose leaders had embraced indulgent materialism as a path to salvation. Luther's philosophies gained the attention of a wide audience. His followers were known as Protestants, and his views appealed to the literate middle class in Europe because he believed that everyone should be able to read the Bible for themselves. Calvinism, Anglicanism, and Protestantism are a couple of different faiths that we will talk about, different churches that we'll talk about. Now, Luther's followers became known as Protestants. And again, his teachings really appealed to the middle class in Europe. John Calvin established a Protestant society in Switzerland, in which magistrates and ministers cooperated to rule over society. Calvin believed in predestination and created his own version of Protestantism based on the theory of predestination, or the notion that God had determined salvation at the beginning of time and that humans could not control their destinies. Anglicanism, or the Church of England, was established in the 1530s by King Henry VIII, when the Pope had refused to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. The Protestant Reformation spread through Europe and into England. King Henry VIII created the Church of England simply because of the practice of the church that ultimately decided if a person could seek annulment or not, could leave their spouse or not. Now, what's important here is that even though King Henry creates the Church of England, the church itself retains many of the practices of the larger Catholic Church. The big distinction is that now the king can marry whomever he pleases. In Spain and France, the Catholic Counter-Reformation prevented Protestantism from gaining much traction. The Council of Trent, established between 1554 and 1563, aimed at reforming the worst abuses of the Catholic Church. In an effort to stamp out the growth of Protestantism, the Catholic Church, along with the governments of Spain and France, sought to reform the corrupt practices of bishops and priests that had been found to engage in various seminaries, and the goal was to generate and rejuvenate confidence within the church. Religious upheavals contributed to empire building in North America as religious leaders urged followers to expand across the Atlantic. Religious conflicts in Europe led to a crisis that pushed people to immigrate to the New World. Europeans of both Catholic and Protestant faiths encouraged the spread of their beliefs across the Atlantic. Struggles at home sent those minorities seeking for religious freedom in North America. Conflicts in Europe helped to generate growth in the Americas. After 1573, the Spanish authorities determined that missionaries would now have charge over the new settlements. Franciscan priests established missions north of Mexico in Pueblo villages, and some Pueblos converted, but often they retained elements of their traditional belief system. Now, it's important to understand that many people converted for the sake of self-preservation, so they converted outwardly, but not necessarily inwardly. Spaniards continued to expand further into North America, and because of the Counter-Reformation, Spain emphasized its new religious mission. Franciscos establishing pueblos in places like New Mexico, as well as working to maintain some of the traditional practices in spite of the impact of the Spanish people. Now, in their effort to promote conversions to Catholicism, the Spaniards forced the Pueblos to adopt many European ways. The Franciscans forced the Pueblos to adopt to those European ways as well. Particularly, they used forced labor, which was in defiance of Spanish law. Wealthy landowners also demanded goods from the labor of the Pueblo people. In 1598, Juan de Oñate established a trading post and a fort in the Rio Grande Valley. His soldiers stole Pueblo corn and raped or slaughtered those who resisted. Spaniards feared retaliation and ultimately abandoned the region. The Pueblos fought back. They killed 11 soldiers at Acoma, and in response to that, the Spanish killed 800 men, women, and children. As a result of this, we see the Spanish begin to withdraw from the area. In 1610, the Spanish returned to found what is known as Santa Fe, and they established a network of missions and estates. The Pueblos initially accepted this situation in part because they hoped that the Spanish might help to protect their village from raids by neighboring tribes. But they quickly lost faith in the Franciscans when the drought conditions did not improve. The Pueblos tended to view Spanish control and acknowledge the coexistence with the Spanish people as a way to be protected from the Apache and the Navajo. But when the benefits of allying with the Spanish seemed to wear off, the Pueblos resisted, and limiting that resistance prevented the Spanish Empire from expanding. The French, the Dutch, and the English investors became interested in North America in the late 16th century as Spain's hold on the New World began to weaken. Now, in chapter 1, I asked the question, why was Spain more successful in nation building and settling, conquering parts of South America and even southern North America when the French, the English were not? And we see that there is ultimately a decline in the Spanish influence in North America and in South America. The French, the Dutch, the English investors became very interested in North America in the late 16th century. And this is taking place around the same time that Spain's control over this new world is starting to weaken. In 1588, England, with Dutch help, defeated the Spanish Armada. Philip II of Spain hoped to invade England in retaliation for England's attacks on Spanish shipping. The English and the Dutch stopped the Spanish attempt to invade England and sought to ensure that many nations would have access to North America. When King Philip II was defeated in Spain, the French took advantage of an opportunity to gain a foothold in North America. In an effort to establish fervent trade networks, the French approached colonization in a different way than the Spanish had. Although France was Catholic, French explorers adopted different attitudes and policies. The French were interested in trade, not conquest, and they needed alliances with local tribes. The French collaborated with the Native Americans and built relationships and facilitated trade. The Edict of Nantes in 1598 granted tolerance to French Protestants and allowed the French to focus on developing an American empire. So we have two distinct approaches to the Americas. We have the Spanish who want to conquer the land and extract wealth from the land. And we have the French who want to establish trade networks and certainly gain wealth, but they don't necessarily intend to conquer the land and build empires. The French and Indian traders did not solely trade goods. They also influenced one another's culture. French traders adopted Indian cultural patterns that were beneficial to trade, including the use of canoes, an embrace of women's contributions to trade relationships, and the acquisition of skills in native languages. Indians embraced the use of European tools. Intermarriage was often a part of this pattern. Samuel de Champlain founded the first permanent French settlement at Quebec in 1608. He allied with the Hurons but made enemies of the Iroquois. Few French settled in North America, in spite of the flourishing trade with the Indians. Government policies and the harsh Canadian winters discouraged mass migration. Despite Catholic criticism, some fur traders married Indian women, which gave the traders kinship ties to powerful tribes. As the fur trade expanded from Canada into the Great Lakes region, the traders were critical in warding off English expansion. Now, the French established Montreal in 1643, but as they expanded beyond the St. Lawrence Valley, their Huron allies were left open to attacks from the Iroquois. The Iroquois, who were armed with Dutch weapons, assaulted the Huron villages and killed dozens of Jesuit missionaries. In spite of war and disease limiting France's ability to fully exploit its North American empire, French explorers expanded their territory across Canada and southward along the Mississippi and Louisiana. As the French sought to expand the trade network, those relationships grew much more complicated. With the Iroquois able to attack the Huron, the relationships became very complicated and very strained. The Dutch had economic, not religious goals in North America. Building ships for Spain had increased the wealth of the merchant class, but the Dutch were Calvinist, not Catholic. In 1581, the Netherlands became an independent colony, and by 1600 it had become a Protestant haven and commercial center. The first Dutch colony in North America, New Amsterdam, grew out of the Dutch East India Company, an effort to control the trade routes around the world. The Dutch expanded their influence in Europe by serving as a key center for trade. Now, if you're curious, New Amsterdam is the southern tip of Manhattan Island, what is present-day Manhattan Island. In 1609, the Dutch established a settlement on the Hudson River so that they could trade with the Iroquois nation. In 1614, the trading post was relocated to Fort Orange near Albany. The Dutch establishing New Amsterdam hoped that this would ward off any English raid attempts and hoped that their new Netherland colony would attract diverse settlers. The Dutch set up trade in present-day New York. And as a result, we see a variety of trades and backgrounds that come into contact with this area at this particular time. Now, problems arose between the Indians and the Dutch settlers as colonists began to establish farms that infringed upon the Anglican settlements. At the same time, the Dutch livestock ravaged the Indian cornfields, and as a result, conflict began to escalate, and it boiled over in 1643 when Governor William Kieft launched a murderous attack on an Indian encampment. This sparked retaliations and began 2 decades of warfare that ended with Anglican defeat. Jamestown was founded in 1607 on a site that was easily defensible but ultimately unhealthy. The Virginia Company set out to establish settlements in North America from North Carolina to New York. The Virginia Company, in addition to fostering trade in precious metals, had a goal of the propagation of Christianity. England's colonization efforts depended on the success of privately financed joint stock companies, whose investors gained royal support. In 1606, some London merchants formed this Virginia Company, and James I gave them this land. As a result, the men recruited as colonists by the Virginia Company were more interested in finding gold than they were in converting Indians. They hoped for the same success and wealth as their Spanish counterparts. The English established communication with the Powhatan Confederacy, a group of Anglican-speaking Indians that was more powerful than all of the English settlers, and supported the settlers in Jamestown for the first 2 years. Now, Powhatan believed that he could get English cloth and tools from the English if he continued to support them. But conflict began to brew in the colonies. Although the English were hostile, the Indian chief Powhatan tried very hard to maintain a friendly relationship, to support these settlers as they are adjusting to this new territory, with the hope that they will be able to get weapons, tools, and of course defend themselves from their Huron enemies as well as the Dutch. But the Jamestown settlers routinely raided the Anglican villages, and this made Powhatan very weary of newcomers. At the same time, the Virginia Company needed to attract new settlers to the area, and they did this by selling 7-year joint stock options and enticing newcomers to start producing stable crops for export. Those who couldn't pay cash to come to the United States or to come to the Americas could become indentured servants in Virginia, and they would receive land after 7 years of labor. For many people in Europe, this was a lucrative proposal because many people in Europe had no land, they had no job, they were destitute, they were orphaned, they were homeless, and this was an option for them. Even though they would be leaving Europe and potentially leaving their family, this was a way to come to this new world and hopefully work for a few years and be able to amass some individual wealth and either stay in this new world with a farm or return to Europe. In 1609, 600 new colonists arrived in Jamestown. The new colonists had not brought enough supplies with them, and a severe drought limited the ability of the natives to help. This time period, known as the Starving Time, lasted through the winter of 1609 into 1610. It killed most of the colonists. The Powhatan responded to the influx of settlers by initially offering some provisions, but the shortages meant that the vast majority of colonists starved or died from disease. The survivors planned to return to England, but were met at the harbor with 3 shiploads of colonists and supplies. Jamestown was saved by the arrival of these new colonists and fresh supplies, which arrived at Jamestown in 1610 in June. A larger population did allow for those earliest settlers to survive, but it also encouraged a more aggressive posture toward the natives. John Rolfe discovered a variety of tobacco that grew very well in Virginia by 1614, and the product, known as a cash crop, became a quick source of economic sustainability in Jamestown. Annual exports multiplied rapidly, reaching 1.5 million pounds by 1629. Tobacco changed the relationship between the colonists and the Indians because more and more land was cultivated and more settlers arrived. With the colony growing more stable and an increase in settlers, the relationships between the Powhatan and the English grew much more tense and competitive. This culminated in Rolfe's marriage to Powhatan's daughter, Pocahontas, as an effort to create peace in 1614. Pocahontas converted to Christianity and traveled with Rolfe to England 2 years later, where she fell ill and died in 1617. Powhatan died shortly thereafter, and his brother took over as chief. Now, the Virginia Company gave land to settlers who could pay their own passage, but allowed those who couldn't afford to come to work as servants for 7 years, after which they would be granted their independence and most likely some land. Now, very early on, these indentured servants were able to obtain land, but as time goes on and more people are coming into the Americas, the available land that could be granted begins to decrease. The House of Burgesses, which was established in 1619, gave the Virginians some autonomy and the ability to control their own colony, even though the company or the crown could really veto any laws that people made. Members of the House of Burgesses could tax and create laws for Virginians. The company supported expanding the colony by arranging for women to come to this new world. Now, the tense relationship of the Powhatan people and the English will grow more tense after the death of Chief Powhatan. The English continued the hostilities and declared that they owned all of the land which they had settled, regardless of the fact that the natives had been here in this country or on this land much longer than these English had been in the New World. Opposition to English expansion through royal proclamation and retaliatory violence was largely unsuccessful, and we see violence continue into the 1640s. So we have about 40 years of tense relationships between the natives and the English. In 1624, Virginia became a royal colony, and James I appointed a governor and council and required that the Privy Council ratify all legislation that had been passed by the House of Burgesses. He also demanded taxes to support the Church of England. Now, these regulations became the standard for all other royal colonies. So this taxation is beginning in the early 1600s. In 1644, the Anglicans again attacked, and this time they killed 500 colonists. After 2 years of fighting, the chief was killed and the Anglican people surrendered. Now, here you have a map of Jamestown, and you can see that these are all of the various native groups that live in this area that these colonists are attempting to settle. Here we have an engraving of Pocahontas, and in this engraving, which is from the early 1600s, the English revered the powerful monarch Elizabeth I, for whom Virginia was named after, and although Elizabeth had died a few years before this particular engraving was made, there are clues that the artist of this engraving was still very much influenced by this national pride in a female ruler. And in this we can see the different representation of a Native woman. In most of the representations of Native women at the time, Natives were always viewed as savages. They were not portrayed very well. Established by King Charles I in 1632, the Maryland colony was established as a refuge for Catholics. Virginia was a successful colony in the 1630s, as wealthy planters used the thousands of indentured servants from England and Ireland, as well as Africa. Maryland was founded as a Catholic haven by the Calverts, who recruited skilled artisans and Protestant farmers along with Catholic merchants and aristocrats to settle the land. Now, the Maryland Assembly passed the Act of Religious Toleration in 1649, and this granted religious freedom to all Christians. Maryland and Virginia constituted the Chesapeake region of the English Empire. Both relied on cotton and used African labor in addition to white indentured servants. Fewer white indentured servants led to an increase in Africans after 1650. In 1660, Virginia began the process of legally separating African slaves from English servants, and Maryland followed suit in 1664. In 1660, the House of Burgesses passed a law in Virginia that African laborers could be enslaved. Maryland passed the same law 4 years later. Slavery expanded, and Virginia codified slavery using the Barbados model, which defined slaves as chattel or movable property. Now, this is a very important part of history because we need to know these dates and we need to understand what this means. In 1660 and 1664, Virginia and Maryland, respectively, in their law, write that people who have come or been brought into this new world from Africa are chattel, meaning they're movable property. They can be bought and sold and traded just as livestock. In spite of the growth of slavery, indentured servants made up the majority of the bound labor in the Chesapeake area for most of the 17th century. All servants could be treated poorly, and some joined with Africans to run away or plot rebellion. Though it differed from slavery, indentured servitude was harsh and cruel. Servants were beaten and suffered extreme abuses. Female servants who became pregnant had their contracts extended. Abuses of indentured servitude fostered a system of rebellion. By the 1660s and 1670s, former indentured servants had become increasingly unhappy. The only land available was land on the frontier area, and this brought settlers into conflict with the natives. Virginia Governor Sir William Buckley was virtually no help. He refused to harm his trade relationship with the Anglicans and protect those former indentured servants. Former servants struggled and expressed resentment toward their former masters. Those who went west were met with hostilities from natives. In 1675, conflicts between the Indians and the colonists escalated. Berkeley, offering no help, contributed to Nathaniel Bacon's efforts to raise an army. The army attacked the natives. Bacon's army was made up of farmers, elite planters, and those who had been excluded from colonial power, as well as servants. Now, Bacon's army is a truly diverse force at the time because there could be African slaves, there could be indentured servants, there were people who had already earned their freedom who were excluded from colonial power because they weren't wealthy and they did not own businesses. They didn't have a royal connection. But there were also people who did have wealth, who were a part of this effort on the part of Bacon to insist on support from the governor. Now, Bacon, because he was raising this army, was charged with treason. As a result, he marched his followers through Jamestown and burned the capital to the ground. In 1676, Governor Berkeley declared that Bacon was a traitor. Bacon's army had, by the time they had reached Jamestown, the governor had fled. And Bacon, of course, does not live long enough to really enjoy his victory or be able to make any changes. Berkeley regains power, and as a result, he hangs 23 rebels, plundered the estates of those with any money or capital, but he couldn't repair the relationships with the natives. Berkeley remains in power, but the relationship with the natives is completely tarnished. As a result of this, we begin to see the transition to the use of African slaves from indentured servants. The most elite planters realized that if there was any type of interracial alliance forming, that they would lose power. And as a result, they allowed the white rebels who had been a part of this effort to go home. And those who were black were either killed or had their freedoms so sharply curtailed that they could not resist again. The Royal African Company was chartered in 1672 to bring African slaves to North America. Now remember, in 1660 and 1664, Virginia and then Maryland codify slavery in their law to make black African slaves chattel or movable property. And just a few years later, in 1672, the Royal African Company is established for the sole purpose of bringing African slaves into North America. Here on this map, you can see the growth of the English settlement in the Chesapeake area here. You can see the various areas of settlements and forts, as well as the various native villages. And this is very important because remember, these areas out here are areas where we've already had natives who were in the regions, and now they are starting to retreat into this western area beyond kind of this imaginary line. And they're retreating with the hope that they will be able to live free of European influence. Hoping to gain a foothold in the West Indies, the English gravitated to Barbados, where they brought indentured servants, planted tobacco and cotton, and raised livestock. The English saw their stake in Barbados waver as taxes and tobacco prices begin to decline. Planters mitigated their losses by shifting from tobacco cultivation to sugarcane. The transformation generated economic growth in Europe through the refinement industry and English planters. By the 1640s, were completely at the center of the growing sugar economy. Now, you might wonder why sugar is such an important commodity. And it's an important commodity for a variety of reasons. One, it is a primary ingredient in producing things like wine and other alcohol. Additionally, it has become a luxury item at this particular time. Pilgrims purchased a charter from the Virginia Company to establish a community that was religiously isolated and free from the influences of the Catholics, the Anglicans, and from European cosmopolitanism. Now, the English investors developed settlements in the Caribbean to further enhance their prospects. Barbados is particularly attractive to the settlers, particularly because the climate is very conducive to producing sugarcane. And sugarcane truly transforms the Caribbean area. Now, the consumers wanted the sugar, but it was very, very difficult to produce without a very, very large labor force because it was a labor-intensive commodity. The Dutch formed a partnership with the English in which the Dutch would supply the knowledge and the refining capability, and the English would supply the land. English Pilgrims purchased the charter from Virginia, and it really allowed them to create a settlement with minimal interference. So the Pilgrims are going to come into different parts of North America, while at the same time we start to see sugar cultivation in Latin America. Now, again, the Pilgrims wanted to form their own church. They wanted to live free of all of those influences in Europe. A small group of Pilgrims embarked on the Mayflower in September of 1620. The ship, of course, veered off course and landed on Cape Cod in December. Before leaving the ship, the settlers, led by William Bradford, signed the Mayflower Compact, which was the first written constitution adopted in North America. The local Native Americans, the Wampanoag, had seen their population decimated earlier. And with the difficult winter taking place, the Pilgrims really struggled to survive. And the natives are not necessarily open to being too friendly with these strangers. The Pilgrims established Plymouth, but they're not sure how to interact with the Wampanoag. At the same time, the Wampanoag people have been weakened by a smallpox epidemic that has come through. And so there's a lot of mistrust. And as a result of this, the Wampanoag really are not able to attack or even defend their land. Only half of the settlers who came survived the first winter, specifically due to disease. So the English and the Wampanoag recognize that they need some form of alliance if anyone is going to survive. And as they're all struggling for survival, they create a mutually beneficial system where the Wampanoag would provide the resources that would allow the English to survive. And the Pilgrims established Plymouth, but as a result, they agreed to sort of coexist. The English and the Pilgrims coexist, and the English will help the Wampanoag defeat the Massachusetts natives in the area who have been a threat to the Wampanoags. This helps the Wampanoag to maintain dominance in the region and helps the Pilgrims to maintain some level of peaceful coexistence and survive those first few harsh winters. Now, the Puritans had encountered persecution in England, but they also believed that God was punishing England in the form of social, economic, and environmental problems. The Puritans believed that New England would be a fresh start. With a better financial base than other settlers, the Puritans landed north of Plymouth and established Boston. They encountered a commercial, self-governing colony in which all males were political participants. With little difficulty, the Puritans found themselves able to self-sustain and thus able to expand their colony. They engaged in commerce, shipping codfish, lumber, wheat, rye, oats, pork, cheese, and other products to England. The ratio of men and women was almost even, which allowed for natural reproduction and consistent growth. The Puritans built a friendly relationship with the Massachusetts tribe and promoted missionary work and religious education. Some Indian converts attended Harvard College, and on a wider scale, Christianized Indians lived in what was called praying towns. Though missionary work was successful, Indians do continue to observe their traditional customs. Puritans believed that God was frustrated with Christians who had strayed from his teachings, and they believed that those who had received his grace were saints, and that one's sainthood was predetermined. In the 1620s, the Puritans had begun to plant churches in North America, and the Puritans considered New John Winthrop had helped the group to get the royal charter for the Massachusetts Bay, and he believed that a Puritan settlement would become a model, quote, city upon a hill, and as a result, it would inspire reform and great change in England. About one-third of English Puritans immigrated to Massachusetts Bay, and they were much better supplied than the previous settlers, and they also learned from the mistakes of their predecessors. The Puritans believed that God was responsible for all positive and negative aspects of life. They saw positive advancements as remarkable providences and setbacks as God's work. And this belief system allowed the Puritans to feel at ease with the world around them. The Puritans developed a successful colony, in part because they were united. Conformity rather than dissent was essential to the Puritan political process. But there were instances of conflict and political critique. In the 1630s, Roger Williams criticized the Puritan leaders for not being pure enough. He believed that not all leaders were saints. In 1635, he was forced out of Massachusetts Bay and founded Providence in what became Rhode Island. In his colony, Williams welcomed those of other religious faiths and insisted on the separation of church and state. That's a significant tenet. It originates again in Providence in what becomes Rhode Island by Roger Williams. He forged alliances with local natives in the area. Now, what's important to understand is that Williams truly believed that some people could go to hell regardless, and that they could fall from grace, that not everyone was a saint, and someone could start out living right and change. And that really separated him from many of the others in his community. In 1637, Anne Hutchinson was accused of sedition because she criticized Puritan leaders for opposing a pure covenant of grace. After Hutchinson claimed that she had received an immediate revelation from God, she was convicted of heresy and banished. Now, she criticized the Puritan leadership on the basis of this revelation that she believed came from God, who, according to Puritan doctrine, could only speak to men. Hutchinson was a threat, of course, because she was a woman. Puritans believed in a firm patriarchal hierarchy, and though she had stepped outside of her divine ordained role in speaking out,